Welcome to Lesson 13 in Somatic Movement Patterns, Hip and Shoulder Rolls, Part 3. In our third part here, we'll be combining elements that we learned in the first two parts into a hip and shoulder roll pattern, and also adding in some very interesting variations. Let's start by having you roll flat onto your back. Take a moment with your eyes closed to take an internal inventory. Notice how your shoulders feel, how flat they are against the floor. Noting the same with your lower back, waist, and hip areas. And roll over onto your left side. Comfortably pillowing your head and positioning your legs at a right angle to the body. You can let the right arm drape across the hip. And I want you to bring your attention simultaneously to the right shoulder and the left hip. And I want you to bring both up higher. And relax. And do that again. Shoulder and hip both lifting up. And relax. And do that one more time. Hip and shoulder come up. And slowly release. Now let's do just the opposite. Move the hip and the shoulder both downward. And release. And down again. And relax. And one more time. Down. And this time as you release your downward push, segue into an upward lift. Move the hip and the shoulders down and move them up. Noticing the full range of motion. And if the hip and the shoulder both move in the same way, or if one moves more easily or more freely than the other. Now pause and bring the hip and the shoulder both forward and then pull them both back. Bring them both forward and pull them both back. And one more time forward and one last time back. And just rest comfortably for a moment. Now, bring the hip and the shoulder both forward, or both up rather, and from up, move them both forward, nice and slow, and then from forward, push them both down, and pull them both back, and both up, and forward, so that the hip and the shoulder move in a perfect tandem arrangement, just like two bicycle wheels, turning, turning, turning. And pause, and now move your hip and the shoulder both back, both down, both forward, and both up. Nice and slow, very smooth movement, circling around. Boom, 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 boom. Down, forward, up, and back. Down, up, back. Down, forward, up, and back. And I'll come back to neutral and just rest for a moment. And I'm going to ask you to roll onto your back. And close your eyes and notice how the right side of your body from your shoulders all the way down through your back into your hip and waist area compares to the left. Now when you roll over onto your right side, I'm going to flip around so that you can get your best view. Now on your right side, bring the knees up and bring your attention to your shoulder and left hip, and bring them both up and relax. And do that again. Hip and shoulder come up and relax. One more time. Up, slowly release. And then go ahead and push the hip and the shoulder both down as if you're trying to make that left side longer. And relax. And lower again and release. And one more time, hip and shoulder go down. And this time as you release, go ahead and bring the hip and the shoulder both up so you can experience that full range of motion. All the way down and all the way up. All the way down and all the way up. One more time, down and release. Now, bring your hip and your shoulder both forward. Let that left leg just glide across the right leg and relax. And forward. And release, and go ahead and draw the hip and the shoulder back. And now move them forward again. And back. So you feel the whole left side of your body moving in a very deliberate and organized fashion. Forward and back, and just release for a moment. Now let's go ahead and bring the shoulder and the hip both up. And from up, slowly move them both forward. From forward, push them both down, and from down, pull them both back. Pull up, push forward, push down, pull back. Up, forward, down, and back. And around, and around, matching the movements so the hip and the shoulders stay in tandem with each other. And one more time around to the front, all the way down, back, and up, and pause. Now we're going to go into reverse. Pull the hip and the shoulder back, move them down, push them forward, pull them up, back, down, forward, and up, back, down, forward, and up. That's great. Now just roll over onto your back. And notice how your shoulders and hips feel and how they compare to each other. Now, if you simply content yourself with what we've learned so far, that's a pretty good lesson. At this time, I'm going to introduce to you a very interesting and probably quite challenging variation. So if you feel like you need more time to practice the movements that we've learned up to this point, by all means indulge yourself that practice time before trying your hand at this variation. Let's have you roll onto your left side. So previously we learned how to move the hips and the shoulders in tandem. And now we're going to do a movement pattern that's a little bit more complicated because it will have you moving the hips and the shoulders in anti-tandem. So let's have you start by bringing the hip up and the shoulder down. And release. And now, move the hip down as you bring the shoulder up. And release. Bring them closer together. Release. And move them further apart. And release. Now let's have you bring the shoulder back as you bring the hip forward. And relax. This time, bring the shoulder forward as you move the hip back. And relax. Now move the hip down and move the shoulder up. From this position, move the shoulder back as you bring the hip forward. Move the shoulder down as you bring the hip up. Move the shoulder forward as you pull the hip back. Shoulder up, hip down. Shoulder back, hip forward. Shoulder down, hip up. Shoulder forward, hip back. Now this can be very confusing when you first start to learn the moves. So anytime you need to stop and start over again, that's just fine. I'll guide you one more time here. Shoulder up, hip down. Shoulder back, hip forward. Shoulder down. Shoulder up, hip down, shoulder back, hip forward. Shoulder down, hip up, shoulder forward, hip back. And try and get into a nice, easy anti-tandem pattern. And then just relax and roll onto your back. Now, just to give you the benefit of an alternate vantage point, I'm going to turn my back to the camera while we do the same pattern to the opposite side. So roll onto your right side and bring the left hip up and the left shoulder down. Release. And bring the left hip down and the left shoulder up. Release. And try that again. Move them closer, relax, and move them away from each other. Relax. Now bring your hip forward as you bring the shoulder back. Release and reverse. Hip goes back, shoulder goes forward. Release. Now move the shoulder up and the hip down. Shoulder back, hip forward. Shoulder down, hip up. Shoulder forward, hip back. Shoulder up, hip down. Shoulder back, hip forward. Shoulder down, hip up. Shoulder forward, hip back. And here again, try and get into a nice, slow cadence where the hip and the shoulder are both circling in the same direction, but at a half-turn delay. Very good. Now pause and roll onto your back. And close your eyes. Turn your attention inward. Quiet your breath. And take stock of yourself, noticing how the hips, the lower back, the upper back, and the shoulders all feel. This completes your series in hip and shoulder rolls. Thank you.